see it. Now, without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Elena Schlachta, Measurement Architect. Dr. Elena, let's get this webinar started. Please share your screen.
Awesome. Well, hello, everyone. I see that our goal, Kristen and I, was to get 30 live attendees. So we are almost to that 30 mark. And of course, this recording will be available to everybody else who couldn't come in person. I just want to give a few more logistics before I screen share. And that is, this will be a very interactive session, and I'm going to be using AHA slides. So here in a moment, whip out your cell phone. Two reasons that we'll be using the cell phone. One is to collect some data and get some interactivity. That will be really great for the recording. Sometimes the comments and questions that are captured in chat don't bode well for recording. So we will have opportunities to engage in AHA slides. So have your cell phones ready, and there will be opportunities for us to use the chat as well, but very minimally so. Sorry, David, to hear that your wireless carrier is not great. It's okay. You'll still have a good time, even if you're passively observing other people share in the AHA slides. So just like Kristen said, please do share in the chat where you're joining us from, because that's interesting for me. I'm here in Austin, Texas, where the temperature is a lovely 75 to 80 degrees. And other folks, it looks like we've got Seattle in the house, Anchorage, Alaska. Wow. By the way, I'm crossing my fingers. I will be going on a cruise, hopefully next year. I'm doing a tour of Anchorage and other parts of Alaska. So I hope to have that in my future. Let's see who else. Madison, Wisconsin. Oh, Mike, welcome. Great to see you. I hear that Wisconsin is a big swing state for the upcoming election. So I've been following that a little bit closely, and welcome. Great. Well, thanks for being here and spending an hour with me and with each other. So without further ado, get those cell phones ready. I'm going to share my screen and bring up our AHA slides presentation. Great. It looks like participants can now see my screen. That is fantastic.
Success.
Success. And I'm going to make sure I'm going to just exit and start the presentation one more time, because I just want to have a full view. And there it is. Beautiful. So if you don't know me already, I am Dr. Elena Schlachta. I'm a big data nerd. And so the time that we spend together today will actually be digging into the data side of the metrics that matter to stakeholders, because it's one thing to know what matters to our stakeholders. It's another thing to deliver on that. And data plays a big part in that equation. If you are not already connected with me on LinkedIn, please use this QR code and connect with me that way. And of course, there are lots of other ways to stay in touch with me, which you can see here on the screen. So let's jump right in. Obviously, you're coming to this 1-hour workshop because you want to know more about what matters to stakeholders. What I'm curious is, what do you think in your experience makes it difficult for us to get stakeholder buy-in? So here's the QR code for you to join the AHA slides. Took me a second to pull that up. So go ahead and join on your phones. I can see who is participating here, so I can get a sense of, we've got 30 people in the room. How many folks are joining? Great, the numbers are going up. Take a minute and share, in your experience, what makes stakeholder buy-in difficult? So again, this hour presentation is all about figuring out what matters to our stakeholders, using metrics and data to get buy-in and to build those long-term partnerships so that we can do really great work and be as effective and impactful in the organization as possible. So it looks like stakeholders are micro-focused on their business, as they should be, which sometimes means that they're not as focused on training. They're focused on other things. The budget, interesting. Lots of budget coming up here. Not enough data, lack of time management, not understanding the metrics or the work itself. Oh my gosh, I totally resonate with that. As a former corporate learning and development professional, I definitely had the experience where my department lead, as well as our CEO, understood education in a traditional industrial way, but not necessarily in the way that we think about it with good learning science behind it. And that was definitely a struggle for me. So I resonate with that. Always looking for what impacts the bottom line and creating more revenue, which that's important. That's what their jobs are. That's what their roles and responsibilities are all about. Generally, just having a lack of buy-in. I'm curious, what causes it though? So we've got budget, too focused on the business, but what makes it difficult? Any other ideas before we move on? Not wanting change. Interesting. Investing time and resources into the business, but not necessarily as, investing time and resources into what the business sees as non-revenue producing activities. Interesting. So I agree that training is often seen as a cost, not necessarily as a contributor to revenue, and that does not necessarily have to be true. Not being involved in decision making, yes. Not understanding the training needs, not understanding what training can and cannot solve for. That's a great one. Wonderful. Take a few more minutes. Go ahead and share any other ideas that are relevant to what makes stakeholder buy-in difficult. And I do have good news for you that many of the things that are mentioned here can be incrementally improved upon, not overnight solved for, but incrementally improved upon with some of the methodologies that we'll talk about today. So I'm happy that some of the challenges that you're describing, we can address in our now less than 60 minutes left over. Awesome. Thank you for sharing. Keep your cell phones handy. There will be more opportunities to engage in a couple of quizzes, actually, that have great music. Love AHA slides for that. So now, one other question, and this one is actually a tee up, if you will, or a setup for some of the content today. But how strongly do you agree with this statement? I know my organization's most important metrics. Strongly agree, strongly disagree. Remember, I'm a data nerd, so that means I can't go into any kind of workshop without getting some baseline and context around who is in the room. So thank you again for taking the time to answer and engage. Appreciate that. So this is not surprising. We see this interesting sort of dissection of half the group feels like, yep, I know. The other half the group feels like, I probably could know more about what's important to the organization. Not surprising. So the folks that do know, you'll be easily able to answer the next question. And folks that don't have as much clarity around the organization's most important metrics, for this next question, do your best based on your experience. So one more question. And that, of course, intuitively is what metrics are most important to your organization. So if half the folks in the group were like, yes, I know what they are, please go ahead and share them. For the rest of you who are like, oh, I'm not really sure what's most important, take your best guess. What do you imagine are the metrics that are most important to your organization? And I'm specifically using the term organization here and not business because not everybody works for a for-profit. Some of us are government, some of us are nonprofit or NGOs. So those metrics, money, yes. Despite the fact that we might be government, nonprofit, or for-profit, money matters to everyone. Absolutely. What else? Retention, patient experience scores that could be similar to customer experience scores if you're extending that. Sales that surpass output. So that might be a net profit potentially. Publications in high impact journals. I like this one because it gives us market share. So all the marketing activities that we do or putting things into high value books, publications, it makes us look good, and looking good and looking credible and trustworthy gives us market share, whether that's students coming into universities, customers coming into our product lines, et cetera. So that's a great example. Of course, ROI is here. increased services, customer experience, user satisfaction. I love these. These are all great. So what I'm seeing here, and this is not surprising and wonderful, is that I'm seeing a mixture of key performance indicators along with the metrics that matter at the organizational level. There will be a lot fewer organizational metrics for us to track than there will be KPIs. There's going to be a myriad of different key performance indicators that are important to our organizations because we are all different. You see publications, you see patient experience scores, referral metrics, et cetera. Yes, these are all great examples. So keep these in mind, and you can refer back to these slides. But this is just to kind of get our wheels turning around what are some metrics. And then ultimately, we're going to go into the data side of things in here in just a moment. So these are all great. I'm happy to hear that these examples of KPIs and org metrics are what I imagined. So excellent work. Last question before we get into some of the theory and ideas, and then we're going to get into some opportunities to practice. So last question for you as a baseline. I feel confident aligning our learning programs to business metrics. I'm wondering if there's going to be that same split 50-50 like we saw with org metrics. Ooh, interesting. We are all over the board, and that is okay. So we actually have a lot higher alignment confidence than I was imagining, which is wonderful. And I'm glad that I asked because that might mean we can become a little more sophisticated in today's conversation based upon this confidence. And yet, as the numbers come in, things are changing. So I go back to my original statement of we are sort of all over the board. That's okay too. Excellent. We've got most folks have responded to this confidence question. And again, we are sort of leaning on everyone comes from a different place here in our confidence levels. And so that's good. So that means that our conversation today should be giving people a foundation that don't feel as confident aligning learning to business metrics. And for those that feel a little bit more confident, we can give you some opportunities to go deeper and increase the quality of what you're doing in your alignment process. Excellent work. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this QR code so we can see this a little bit larger. So not surprising, alignment is one of the key factors that distinguish high-performing learning teams from everyone else. There are a lot of learning maturity frameworks and data out in the world, and there's even some business research that shows regardless of whether it's learning or marketing or product or customer experience, that when alignment is present between the activities of a department and the organization, that leads to a higher performing organization and, of course, a higher performing department. So learning is also among that. But specific to the learning data, alignment is that key factor that distinguishes high performers from less than ideal performers in the learning space. And I have this image here of a few different, shapes, if you will, because they represent what it sometimes feels like to be in the learning world, where on the far end, we have this rectangle that represents the organizational metrics and goals. And in some ways, that's its own silo or its own island. And then we have the key performance indicators, that turquoise circle, and the KPIs can sometimes feel like they're floating on another island. And then we have our learning department, which is this sideways triangle, which sometimes feel like it's on an island. And then the square represents our learning programs. And so I have this visual here because it is possible for our programs, our department, our KPIs, and our organization to all have different metrics. And sometimes the approach that we take to manage and monitor those metrics will look very different. It doesn't mean that they can't still be aligned and have a story that ties them all together. And the best indicator I can think especially from a stakeholder perspective, would be what I call an alignment score. How well do your programs and your department and your KPIs and the organizational metrics, how well do they all align together? Are they telling a story that makes sense, or are they different islands that sort of exist off in the ether that don't connect? So I wanted to lead with this because if there's one metric that I think can help us build better partnerships with stakeholders, it's an alignment score. It's a constant reflection on how do all of the activities from our programs, our department, our KPIs, and our organization, how well are they aligned? And what can we do to improve that over time? That alignment score I would do on a quarterly basis, get together with your team and just reflect back on the programs that you've done in the past quarter. Do you have a clear story to tell about alignment? And do you have metrics that help you know if you move the needle on some of the KPIs and organizational metrics or not? And what can you do to improve it? So, focusing on that, I believe, will help us to build stronger relationships and better stakeholder buy in over time. So, with that idea, now let's dig into, well, how do we get there? So I love this quote because sometimes we can imagine alignment as a perfect state that we will one day achieve. And once we've achieved it, we never have to think about it again. And that's simply not true. That alignment is actually more about a practice, having the right systems, the conversations, technology tools, all in place such that we can be striving for alignment and not necessarily putting it in the rear view mirror, but something that we focus on an ongoing basis. Because while some of you mentioned your stakeholders don't like change, the reality is change is a constant that we have to figure out how to monitor and stay in a pulse with. And an alignment process or system is the best way for us to do that. But again, it's a practice, it's not an outcome that we leave in the rear view mirror one day. So now on to what matters to stakeholders. And this is going to not be surprising for most of you, but I want to lead the conversation with meeting expectations. Because one of the rude awakenings that I had, so I've got a background in educational research and I got a doctorate degree and a master's degree in education. I've been teaching for forever. I go into an organization and the CEO's expectations is that our learning programs have high NPS scores. Now, most of us know that an NPS score isn't a great indicator of success of learning. And yet that was what the expectation was for the CEO. So I could have made my life really difficult by immediately pushing back, or I could have given the data about NPS scores and collected that data, but I could have also been collecting other data that also shows how our programs were effective. But I like to start with that short story because sometimes the expectations of our stakeholders aren't in alignment with good learning science. They're not even good best practices. Maybe they're pet metrics, and yet they matter to the stakeholder. And so we want to, of course, deliver on that. Doesn't mean we couldn't also be delivering on other things that we know good learning science and good data practices are more important. And so this is, again, going without saying, but understanding what are the expectations for our stakeholders, whether it's at the C-suite or it is the client, if you will, who's requesting training or partnering us with us on training. What are their expectations? Are we incorporating in our intake questions what those expectations are? And then are we incorporating in our debrief and follow-up, did we deliver on those expectations? And how could we improve on that in the future? So I have that as an important thing for us not to forget. And in addition to or alongside those expectations, what matters to stakeholders is exactly what most of you shared at the beginning of this hour, which is revenue, market share, net profit, and employee retention. At the end of the day, these are the most important metrics to our C-suite stakeholders. And in the alignment side of things, we want to be able to demonstrate that our work is somehow contributing to one of these metrics. And despite what some people might tell you, it's actually possible for every one of our learning programs to have an impact or to contribute somehow to one of these metrics. That does include compliance training. So next, the alignment equation. So the rest of our hour is going to be spent on this equation and then practicing figuring out what are the metrics that we should be using in different examples and the data artifacts that would be helpful for us to ultimately tell the story of alignment. So first and foremost, I like to start with the high level, and this will be familiar. This is part of the ROI equation, in addition to the Kirkpatrick model. This is even part of Thalheimer's LTEM model. So this is a familiar place to start. And I wanted to get us to practice pairing some good examples of learning, common examples of learning programs with those finite organizational metrics. We want to start with that relationship and then focus the rest of our time on the stuff in between. So here is our first quiz. So grab your phones if you haven't already. I'm going to pull that QR code back up so that if you jumped out of the presentation and need to jump back in, you can easily do that. So first quiz, and that is dun, 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 dun. Well, I'll let you all join first, but we're going to practice mapping the relationship between a few examples of learning, common learning initiatives. I'm going to turn my volume down. That's mapping a few types of learning programs with some of those common organizational metrics that we just reviewed. I'm just curious if you'll get all these correct, which ones you'll get correct, how much time it might take you. Feel free to use your name, another name, just something that you will remember, because we do have a leaderboard in the end so you can compare how you did with everybody else. So we've got 11 players and 22 people in our AHA slide. So I'll wait a couple more seconds and see if anybody else wants to join. You don't have to. You can still enjoy by watching. That's okay too. A little bit more time for folks to join so that anyone that wants to still can. All right, the numbers are going up. I'll wait a little longer. Don't you love the music? Well, maybe you can't hear it, but I love the music. It's very fun. All right, we've got 17 people out of 22 folks in our AHA slides. If anybody else wants to join, now is the time. Couple more seconds. All right, time is up. Let's begin. So again, this quick quiz is testing your ability to match some common types of learning programs with some of those finite organizational metrics that we just reviewed. Are you ready? You do get extra points for faster responses, no pressure or anything. All right, here we go. You have 1 minute. I actually tested this out myself and I needed more time, so I added a little more time for folks. We've got 20 seconds left. I just caught up on chat, so that's great. 10 seconds. All right, let's see how you did. Oh my gosh, everybody got it right. Okay, so that was obviously very easy. Go ahead and put in the chat just to get a little feedback. What was that like for you? Did you need the full minute? Did you get stuck? Which ones were more difficult to figure out? Just want to get a little bit of pulse on what this was like for everyone to map these things. So David, you obviously must have fell into that group of I understand metrics and I also feel like I have great confidence aligning learning with organizational outcomes. Yes, learning curve. Any other thoughts on what this was like? Plenty of time. Okay, so I could have made it harder, obviously. Great. So, Michelle, we can unpack why compliance training aligns with net profit. Happy to do that. Kristen had time to double check. That's great. So that means I gave you plenty of time to be able to get the right answer. So I love that. So let's unpack, and I'm glad this came up. Why is it net profit that aligns with compliance? Actually, before I answer this question myself, I'm curious if other folks have some thoughts of their own, because you got it right, maybe by deduction, that's okay. But does anyone feel like I understand why compliance is aligned with net profit that would like to share in chat? Yeah, avoiding fines. What else? We can unpack this even a little bit further. Why is net profit aligned with compliance? Yes. Again, we can unpack that even further. It's not necessarily about spending, although it could be spending in one specific category. Why is net profit aligned with compliance? In some ways, it's because it doesn't make sense to do it with other programs. Compliance training won't necessarily generate more revenue. Compliance training is probably not going to help us with employee retention, although I could see an argument to be made there. I don't think that compliance is going to help us with market share. So in some ways, there's a bit of deduction there. But yes, Dana and Carrie, you are absolutely right that net profit is calculated by revenue minus expenses, and thus lawsuits and safety incidents and other types of risk that compliance training is meant to prevent through information or other regulatory types of training. They're designed to prevent those kinds of safety, lawsuits, et cetera. And so net profit is the most appropriate metric for us in that case. I hope that makes sense. And actually, it's a pretty easy one to calculate. So here's another little data point for you all. Some of you might know this, but ultimately, some recent ATD research found that about 70% of the work in L&D is done on compliance or regulatory training. Thumbs up if that resonates with you all. That maybe 70% of your team's work or 70% of your personal work is really done in the compliance sector. So we've got one thumbs up. That's okay if it doesn't resonate with you. There are still 30% of folks that are doing other types of work. But overall, a large majority of the L&D initiatives that we are spending time on are in that compliance space. And so therefore, if we want to be able to map compliance to some kind of organizational outcome, having a net profit equation and understanding that relationship will help us to then talk about with stakeholders how the completion of compliance training is helping the organization from that particular net profit place. So there's definitely a business case to be made for compliance training. Otherwise, we wouldn't be spending so much time on it. Now, I do have to say that just because we have to do compliance training doesn't mean that it needs to be expensive. I think sometimes we overinvest in things that don't need that level of investment, but that's a whole other conversation for a whole other time. So let's move on back to our alignment equation. So everyone did an excellent job of mapping the relationship between our learning programs and organizational goals. Oh, I forgot the leaderboard. Let's see. Everybody should have. All right, Kristen from ELB Learning, you are just too smart. You jinxed everybody. No, I'm kidding. Everyone did a great job. But the leaderboard, of course, is based on time. All right. So the next piece of the alignment equation, again, this is going to be familiar, but it's the performance factor. And that is both a combination of people's performance, and those performance metrics would be people performance. And key performance indicators are metrics that help us to see our systems, our departments, things that are a little bit beyond or accumulation of individual performance. Those are KPIs. So that's, I think, the most complex space of the alignment equation, especially when it comes down to what data should we be using to help us show the alignment of our programs to organizational metrics. So one more quiz for you, and I'm probably imagining that you will get this all correct and in plenty of time, but let's do another test, and that is which examples in this next quiz are KPIs and which examples are performance in terms of individuals doing something. This is probably very intuitive, but hey, let's give it a whirl anyway. You get a little less time on this one. All right, we shouldn't have to have anyone join. You've already joined, so good luck. Performance metrics versus KPIs. You've got 30 seconds for this one and counting. All right, how did we do? Oh, interesting. So we actually had a little bit of a reverse. I was not expecting this. Now go ahead and put in chat if you're like, wait, I was confused by the question. What's your feedback or reflection on the results of this quiz, which again was to just test your sort of innate knowledge of what's a performance metric in terms of individual or people doing activities versus a KPI, which is more at the team, the department, or the system level. Any thoughts on this particular quick quiz? Yeah, I made it harder for you, David. You were the first one that said you had plenty of time with 60 seconds, so I thought I would give you less time this time around. Any other thoughts on maybe it's just the time? With more time, you would have got it correct. Any other reflections on why we maybe didn't do so well on this one? All right, Dana, David, you just ran out of time. Understood. So if you had had more time, probably we would have gotten these correct. I think I set you up for failure because you were expecting to have a whole 60 seconds this time around. Well, good. Well, here's the quick reflection, and that is I'm just going to actually go, I think I'm going to go back, but maybe I'm going to go forward. We don't need the leaderboard this time. Yeah, I'm going to go back quickly. So in the alignment equation, I think everyone has an intuition for the examples, the types of relationships that we're looking for between learning programs and organizational metrics, and then of course the performance factor. But aligning all these things up is essential, and getting the right data to put together a story of the relationship between learning program all the way up to organizational metric. That's really our key role in building relationships with stakeholders and giving the data back that matters to stakeholders in a way that makes sense to them, but also helps us get ideas for where can we improve, what went right, what went wrong, and where do we prioritize our changes and efforts for the future. So I want to go next to some key questions. And for participants, here we go. So here's a very simplified framework. I know many of you are in the L&D sector for many years, and you might have other questions that you ask, but in its simplest form, these are the questions that I think are important and that I like to ask when working toward alignment. And I always, of course, start with, well, what are we targeting here? What's the program designed to target in terms of the organizational outcome? And while the stakeholder might have another set of expectations, outside of that, we really only have a few core organizational metrics that we will be influencing, and likely it's just one. I could probably come up with an example of how one learning program could align with multiple organizational metrics, but in many cases, our learning programs will only align with one most appropriate metric. So that makes things a little bit easier. But the place where it gets more difficult is in that center area, the key performance indicators and the performance metrics. And so here are the questions, generally speaking, that I think are really helpful for us to work toward that alignment. So before I move on, how many other examples of intake questions? Maybe you have a different one that you like to use, but these basic questions are a great starting place. And I like to work backwards. What's the targeted metric for the organization? How will our KPIs grow or expect to be grown or changed because of our program? What do we expect people to be doing to get movement in those KPIs? And then of all the learning outcomes we could target, which ones are most important for us to target in the program itself? Are there any other questions that you think are important or that you've asked in the past to help create this kind of outcome? Allison says, I don't like the clock for our games. Don't worry, Allison. There are no more games and no more clock. Are there any other examples of intake questions that you've used yourself or that you like or would like to use in the future that helps us to work toward that alignment? Go ahead and share them in the chat. So I think there's a lot of very talented, smart people in the room. And if there are some great questions that you'd like to share for others to benefit from, please put them here. I'll wait another minute or so, or less than a minute, maybe 30 seconds. Mastery of skills. Cindy, I'm curious if you can frame that into a question. Because at this point in our working of the framework and working toward alignment, we want to ask questions. And maybe the question is simply how much of the skills do people already have mastery of? So some kind of baseline knowledge or skill check. Maybe we already have that data from other initiatives that we've done and we just want to look toward that. And then Allison says, we focus on apprenticeship programs. So they are a longer time frame. Absolutely. And I want to say too, Allison, that in those kinds of programs, as leadership development, I think often has a longer time frame to see the kind of alignment. 4,000 hours. Yes, that is a long time frame. I've heard of programs that are 12 months long. I know organizations that have a 12-month onboarding program. And in cases of apprenticeship, that can be longer term. But Allison, what I invite you to reflect on are what are those leading indicators of those organizational metrics, longer term organizational metrics that can help us to track, are we moving in the right direction with our program and initiative, or do we need to change something to get a better outcome for the organization? And so that's what we'll practice here in a moment. Jason says, what challenges might participants face in using what they learn? I love this question. So a good friend of mine who works with the ROI Institute, Holly Burkett, she has an environmental assessment that she does as part of her intake process that I think is brilliant. And it is something in and around this kind of question. So once you've clarified what the performance metrics are, which we'll practice here in a moment, and once you've clarified the performance indicators, the KPIs, the question is, what kind of barriers might the individual experience when they're working toward the performance metrics or the targets in performance? What are some of those things that might get in the way of people being able to do things? And what's interesting is the answer is often not knowledge or a lack of skills or competency. The answer is oftentimes things like there's a competing initiative. People have cognitive overload. We've just turned over some staff and it's a really bad time for us to be rolling out this program, or other kinds of challenges that are all environmental. And yes, Carrie, what blockers exist to reach this KPI? Those are really important questions for us to figure out, is now the right time for this program? Or if we still have to move forward and deliver this program, well, how might we adjust its delivery, its time frame, so that we can help people manage the other competing dynamics that are going along, because that will give us a better chance of reaching those outcomes. So I love those questions, Jason, Carrie, excellent work. Absolutely adding that into our intake process is very important to get toward that alignment. Awesome. So let's take the rest of our time. We've got about 20 minutes left. Let's take the rest of our time in practice, because I think it's one thing to have a theory, have a best practice. It's another thing to actually workshop it. And Kristen was right when she said this is a workshop. We are going to spend the rest of our time workshopping. So here's our context that we're going to be playing around with. Feel free to take a snapshot of this if you would like to refer back to it. So here's the context. We have the opportunity to build a new manager leadership development program. And here was the problem that we uncovered, was that new managers are working 50 to 60 hours a week and they're feeling stressed and burnt out. And oh, by the way, this is a real example. So then we dug a little deeper, going with the 5 whys framework of like, okay, what's contributing to this problem? Well, managers were feeling burnt out and working a lot because they were spending a lot of time on individual contributor activities and not enough time on the strategic managerial activities that way they were expected to do. They are trying to do it all, and there just weren't enough time in the 40 hours, so they were working more. And when we dug a little bit deeper, we found that the reason they were working too much on the individual contributor work and not as much on the strategic managerial work is because they weren't clear on what the priority activities were as a manager. And they didn't have good systems to manage their time. So this is the context for us as we built this new manager development program. And we wanted to be able to ultimately fix some of the deeper level whys through some skill development and practice. And so go ahead and put in the chat, which organizational metric is this program designed to align or support or help? What metric from the organizational perspective is this going to be the most helpful for? Let's start to build that alignment equation out with this. Kristen, retention. Does anyone have a different answer? So productivity. So Carrie, I'm glad that you said this, because as we create the alignment equation, we want to map out all 4 of those variables. The learning program itself will have metrics that we will be tracking and monitoring. The sort of people metrics will have its own set of monitoring and data that we look to know if we've been effective. And we have the KPIs. And then at the end, all of that rolls up to supporting the organization's metrics. So the correct answer is the employee retention. And the reason for that is because the productivity example, Carrie, could be an example of a key performance KPI. Can't speak accurately right now. Productivity may be something that's a leading indicator of employee retention that we would want to be tracking in that KPI area. So you're on target, but the answer is employee retention. So great job. So now, as we're working on this alignment equation, the next question to consider, thinking again back to the problems that we know about the reason for the new manager development program, what are some of the team or department KPIs that should be improved if we're successful with this new manager development program, considering again the problems that were revealed, not clear on priorities, spending too much time on individual contributor work, feeling stressed out and burnt out? What are some of those KPIs that we imagine should be improved or met if this program is successful? Go ahead and put those in chat. And Carrie, you're right on that productivity is a great example. We should see our new managers being productive. What else should we see? What are some of those other indicators to look to that we've been effective in our program? So this well-being piece that is it Adalisa mentioned. So well-being is a big piece in this equation because we knew that managers were feeling stressed and burnt out. So yes, absolutely, there's a relationship between managers' well-being and the new manager retention. So absolutely, we want to be tracking some kind of indicator of well-being for our managers. That's a great one. Retention, we've already captured that as sort of the final variable for us to map. Employee satisfaction. So I could see, Dana, that being either the manager's satisfaction with their role, or it could be the team itself, that they're feeling satisfied on the team. In this case, I think a great leading indicator is how optimistic do managers feel about their work and their stress levels, back to that well-being. We have efforts toward the strategy as a manager. Yes, this is a really important one. One of the leading indicators of employee retention is that people are working on the right activities as a manager versus an individual contributor. Obviously, we have employee performance evaluations that are reflecting on what people are doing, and that plays a role in the retention rate. We want people to be working on the right things. So that's a great example of a KPI. So in our actual example, here are the KPIs that we selected to evaluate in the program. So, and you all were in and around these pretty much. So, Carrie, your point about productivity, we wanted to see that managers were increasing their ability to meet project deadlines because they weren't able to do that. We wanted to see an increase in the amount of time every week that our new managers were working on strategic managerial activities. We also wanted to see a decrease in individual contributor hours. And we wanted to see their stress decrease. So back to the piece about well-being. All of these things together are important leading indicators of employee retention. And they're important together because if we just did one of them, it doesn't tell the same story of alignment. We kind of need them all because of what we know about the problem leading to the need for the training in the first place. So here's where it gets interesting. And we've got 10 minutes left, so this is perfect. This is the part that I think we get wrong, and it's in the data side of things. And I'm going to skip. Let's see, here we go. So in chat, show me the data. So here's the thing. If we want to demonstrate the metric that new managers are hitting their project deadlines, what are the data artifacts that we could use? And actually, don't use chat because I have a quick way for us to collect that here. So feel free to pop it in, use your phones. What are the data artifacts or sources that could be used to measure project completion? And here's the thing, there are a lot of them. And the starting place for us, and this is where we get it wrong, is sometimes we choose data artifacts or data sources that are more complex or costly or time consuming than they need to be. So it's really helpful as a process, once we know what our key performance indicators are, to then brainstorm, well, what are all the possible sources of data or artifacts we could look to help us measure and monitor that KPI of, in this case, project completion. So one example, it's a great one, depends on the CRM, but Salesforce is a common one. So if your projects are managed in a Trello or a Salesforce or a something else, we could absolutely be looking at the data of how people are completing the milestones or the steps of those projects. Here's another one, meeting established milestones. So my very first job out of undergrad, back in my early 20s, I did event marketing, actually. So not surprising, here I am more than 20 years later. And so I had an Excel spreadsheet. And in my Excel spreadsheet, of course, this is way before Trello and other technology tools, I had milestones for all the events that I was managing. And I was managing probably 20 events at a time. And they all had the same milestones. I had to book a venue. I had to set the event up online. I had to get, marketing partners to help me spread the word. And so each of those milestones had a deadline. There was a time frame within which I needed to complete that. So I could use my Excel spreadsheet, share it with my manager, and be tracking, am I completing those milestones on time? So that's a great one without technology even. And then yes, Asana, completion of tickets. So there may be a project management system or projects in which someone submits a support ticket and then it gets responded to in a certain time. And of course, tracking, well, what is that time of response? What's the ideal time of response? And are we meeting that? And then a project launch successfully on timeline. Yes. Yes. Cycle time. These are all great. So here's the challenge for us. And this is the process. Get together with your team. Once you get your KPIs for the program, figure out together what are all the data artifacts we could look to help us measure and monitor if the training program influenced in the right direction the KPIs that it was meant to influence. So with a brainstormed list like this, then the question becomes, what's the most realistic data artifact considering the budget we have to work with, our own knowledge and competence, and what we have access to? So that could be an Excel spreadsheet. That could be a Salesforce or an Asana or a Trello. It could be maybe you track cycle time and there is an existing technology tool or some other report that gives us data back on how much time it's taking to get through certain stages of a process. So any one of these things could be accurate. The opportunity for us is to figure out what's the most realistic data artifact, and then to build that into our measurement system and into that ultimate alignment equation to show the relationship between our program, our people performance, KPIs, and that organizational metric. Great work. All right, so I'm going to skip, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip some more examples, and I want to get into this next piece. So we've got the idea around how this alignment equation is unfolding, right? We start with the relationship between the learning program and the organizational metric. We get that clear. Well, then we go, okay, well, what sort of team or department KPIs should be improved between the learning program and the organizational metric? And this last piece is so important. And if you are a fan of Kirkpatrick model, they do a wonderful job of helping you to unpack this. So if you're struggling to figure out the people performance side of things, I would definitely have a read of the New World Kirkpatrick model. It will be helpful. But this is the piece that is even more difficult sometimes to measure and get data artifacts. And that is, what will people be doing to accomplish the KPIs? So if we had more time, I'd ask you to brainstorm this, but instead I'm just going to show you in our actual program, here's what we came up with. So we wanted to see that people were time blocking on their calendar. So remember back to the problem. People didn't have great systems to manage their time. And so we instituted a time blocking thing, which actually became the data artifact that we use to help people reflect on their strategic hours versus individual contributor hours as one of those KPIs. So what's interesting is the relationship between our performance metrics and our KPIs. They can be really, really nicely aligned as great data artifacts. Clarity on priorities, having them evaluate their stress, because in our expertise, if you will, the research that we did on this program was, what are some of the things that contribute to new managers in terms of their success and the things that get in the way? And if they feel stressed out, well, then they should be delegating. So you can see how all these things are working together. We wanted new managers to start using their calendar to time block the things they had to get done every week. They were also clarifying their priorities as part of that process. Based upon their sort of upcoming calendar or previous calendar, they would evaluate their stress. How do I feel about all the things I have to get done? And if my stress is high, that's an indicator or trigger that I need to start delegating. So part of our program was actually teaching people how to delegate when they were in elevated levels of stress, and then how to successfully supervise the people who were doing those delegated tasks. Because again, one and done isn't going to work. We need to make sure our new managers were set up for success to support their people when those tasks were delegated. And so, of course, each one of these performance metrics, some of them could be data artifacts on their own, time blocking on your calendar. If you have people upload a snapshot of their calendar, you can look to see what percent of individual contributor activities versus strategic activities are plotted out. And so this is, our equation. And I wanted to share this really quickly. This is a bit messy for this particular webinar, but if it's also on your phone, if you want to zoom into it. But we gave individual report cards and organization wide dashboards to show the relationship between doing the program, building skills, the KPI changes, and the organizational outcome. And so this is how we chose to do it. Basically, we had certain things that we taught people, which is that list of infinite guidebook all the way down to a delegation conversation. These were exercises that we taught people. We had them go implement and then reflect on their performance. And then we tracked between the beginning, the baseline, and the end of the 4-week program changes in things like the hours they worked every week, their clarity on their priorities, the time they spent on those priority activities, their time blocking, and then how much time they spent on individual contributor activities versus strategic activities. This was a report card every single participant got, and then they reflected on how well the program set them up for success and what could have been improved upon to get even better results. And then this is the example of, and this is incomplete. I couldn't get the full idea on a slide, but you can see back to the alignment. We want to have indicators of attendance, completion, and satisfaction, our basic learning program outcome metrics, the performance metrics, delegation rate, among other things, project deadline achievement rate, and then a new manager retention rate. This is the alignment story that we'd like to tell to our stakeholders that tells them that we take the relationship seriously, but also the indicators can tell us maybe where we didn't hit the mark. And in the case of this program, we didn't actually see that people worked less hours inside of the 4 weeks or the 1 month that we worked with them. And so that was an indicator that didn't come out as expected, but the relationship between clarity and individual contributor activities versus strategic activities, all of those things moved in the right direction. And we got positive feedback that the program supported people in changing their thinking and their practices to do more of that managerial work. So in the end, it was a success, even if we didn't hit all of our intended targets. So that puts us right at the hour. I can't believe that. It goes by so quickly. Before I go to that, I want to just give you an opportunity to stay connected with me if you aren't already. I have a weekly newsletter, and it talks about things like this in small, simple ways. How can we improve impact measurement? So if you are not already a subscriber to the weekly measure, I would hope that you would join us. This will be accessible to you in our post program notes. But before we have you go away, I want to ask this last question. It is my favorite question to ask anytime I do a workshop, and that is, what's one thing you'll do differently because you participated in this workshop, because you spent 60 minutes, maybe even a minute more with Kristen and I today? What is one thing that you will do differently? And thank you in advance for sharing. This feedback helps me to see how this resonated. And it also gives you a chance to reflect on, well, what am I going to do now that I've invested 60 minutes in this program? Love that. Working backwards, absolutely. Mapping that relationship, rethink alignment. And I hope that you maybe even use the alignment as a score. How well are each of our programs aligned with KPIs and with the organization? How many programs do we do this well with? And how many could we improve upon? And give yourself that score and watch that hopefully increase over time. Yes, I love using the alignment equation as part of the design process. It not only gives us like what do we focus on in our learning design, but also what do we measure and how do we measure it? It's a great way of integrating it all together. Becoming more familiar with L&D terms and techniques. Excellent. There's a lot of great resources out there. And of course, ELB Learning has many of them, Kristen.
Just a couple.
Going back and determining alignment with existing courses and review. I love that. Looking back and figuring out how do we invest our time going forward. It's an excellent exercise. Asking more questions. Wonderful. Yeah, how do we build the alignment equation into our current process? More than likely, your process has some of this already. And so you just want to tweak it a little bit. Excellent.
And we still have people typing.
We do. Yay.
Thanks so much for everybody hanging out a couple minutes later than originally anticipated. We appreciate you.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Discuss KPIs with management. Yeah. What are those team or department level indicators that we should be contributing to if our program is successful? And that should align. It should be a leading indicator of that organizational metric that's so important. Yes. Excellent. Well, thank you. We won't take up any more of your time. Kristen, I'm sure you'll have a few announcements to close us out.
Really, honestly, just thank you to everyone for being here today. Thank you so much to Dr. Elena. I get to see you at DevLearn. Really excited to see the rest of our participants. If you're going to be at DevLearn, please come on out and check us out because we're going to have that massive experience room of 9,000 square feet and we aren't afraid to use it. So thanks for coming today. The recording will be in your email in the next couple of days and all of the information. And hopefully we will see you on another webinar sometime soon. Thanks so much.